The train rattled through the Missouri countryside in late October 1945, its wheels grinding against tracks that had carried soldiers home for months now. But these passengers were different. They sat in silence, 23 German women in faded Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, their hands folded in their laps, their eyes fixed on the floor or the passing fields of harvested corn. The war was over. They had lost. And now they were being transported to a prisoner-of-war camp in a place called Cedar Ridge, a town none of them had heard of, in a country that had every reason to hate them. Greta Hoffmann pressed her forehead against the cool window glass, watching the landscape roll by. She was 24 years old, thin as a rail, with blonde hair cropped short and eyes that had once been bright blue but now seemed gray with exhaustion. She had served as a radio operator in France, then a translator in Berlin during the final chaotic months. When the Soviets came, she had fled west, surrendering to American forces with relief that surprised her. At least the Americans followed rules. At least they didn't. She pushed the thought away. Beside her sat Ilsa, older at 32, a nurse who had worked in field hospitals from Poland to the Ardennes. Ilsa's hands never stopped moving, even now, adjusting her collar, smoothing her skirt, picking at a loose thread. "What do you think they'll do with us?" Ilsa whispered in German. "I don't know," Greta replied. "Work camps, probably. Farms. They need labor with so many men dead." Across the aisle, young Margaret, barely 19, started to cry softly. An older woman, Frau Weber, put an arm around her shoulders. "Hush now. We're alive. That's what matters." The train began to slow. Through the window, Greta could see a small town emerging from the fields. A main street with a few shops, a white church with a tall steeple, houses with front porches and autumn wreaths on their doors. It looked impossibly peaceful, impossibly American, like something from the propaganda films they'd been shown about the decadent West. But there was nothing decadent about Cedar Ridge. It looked tired, worn, real. The train stopped with a hiss of steam. A U.S. Army corporal opened the door to their car. "All right, ladies, this is your stop. Stay together, stay quiet, and follow me." They filed out onto the platform, blinking in the afternoon sunlight. A small crowd had gathered, farmers in overalls, women in house dresses, a few children peeking from behind their mothers' skirts. The prisoners kept their heads down, expecting jeers, expecting stones maybe, expecting the hatred they had seen in the eyes of the French and the Belgians and the Dutch as they retreated. But the crowd was silent. Not hostile, just watching, curious, uncertain. A tall man in his 50s stepped forward, wearing clean work clothes and a felt hat. He had the weathered face of someone who had spent his life outdoors, deep lines around his eyes, strong hands that looked like they knew soil and tools and honest labor. "I'm Tom Brennan," he said, his voice carrying across the platform. "I'm the mayor of Cedar Ridge, and I also run a farm about 3 miles out. Some of you will be assigned to work on local farms. You'll be paid a small wage, given room and board, and treated fairly under the Geneva Convention. You'll work hard, we all do around here, but you'll be treated like human beings." Greta felt something crack inside her chest. Not breaking, but shifting, like ice beginning to thaw. Treated like human beings. When had she last felt like one? Another man stepped forward, older, with white hair and glasses. "I'm Doc Henderson. If any of you are sick or injured, you'll be seen to. No exceptions." He looked directly at them, and Greta was startled by the gentleness in his eyes. A woman in her 40s, sturdy and practical looking, spoke next. "I'm Margaret Sullivan. My husband died at Normandy." The prisoners tensed, waiting for the accusation, the rage. "Some of you will work at my farm. I need help with the harvest. I expect you'll work hard, and I'll feed you well. That's all." The corporal began calling out names and assignments. Hoffmann, Greta, Sullivan Farm. Fisher, Ilsa, Sullivan Farm. Schneider, Margaret, Brennan Farm. Within an hour, they had been divided into small groups and loaded into trucks and wagons. Greta found herself sitting in the back of a pickup truck with Ilsa and 2 other women, watching Cedar Ridge disappear behind them as they drove down a dirt road lined with oak trees losing their leaves to autumn. Margaret Sullivan's farm was modest. A white two-story house with peeling paint, a red barn that leaned slightly to the left, chicken coops, a vegetable garden gone to seed, and fields of corn stubble stretching toward a line of trees. The truck stopped in front of the house, and Margaret climbed out, gesturing for the women to follow. "Leave your bags on the porch for now," she said. "Let me show you where you'll sleep." She led them to the barn, and Greta's heart sank. Sleeping in a barn, like animals. But when Margaret opened the door, Greta saw that half of the lower level had been converted into a clean, simple living space. For cots with real mattresses, blankets folded at the foot of each one, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, a table with 4 chairs, and a shelf with books and a kerosene lamp. There was even a small mirror on the wall and a basin for washing. "It's not much," Margaret said, "but it's warm and dry. The outhouse is behind the barn. You'll take your meals with me in the house. Breakfast at 6, lunch at noon, supper at 6. I expect you up at 5:30 for chores. Feeding chickens, collecting eggs, milking the cow, whatever needs doing. Questions?" Greta spoke in her careful English. "You feed us? In your house?" Margaret looked at her with something like surprise. "Where else would you eat? I'm not running a prison camp. You're workers. You work, you eat. Fair exchange." She paused. "I know you're probably wondering why I'm not angrier. My John died on that beach. I got the telegram 2 days after D-Day. I was angry for a long time. Maybe I still am. But you 4 didn't pull the trigger. You didn't start this war. And I need help and you need work. So we'll make it work." That first evening, they sat at Margaret's kitchen table. A simple wooden table covered with a red check cloth, and ate beef stew with carrots and potatoes, fresh bread with butter, and apple pie for dessert. Greta couldn't remember the last time she had eaten something that wasn't rations or thin soup. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, afraid it might be taken away. Margaret watched them eat with satisfaction. "You girls are skinny as fence posts. We'll fix that." After dinner, they washed the dishes together. Margaret showed them where everything went, how she liked her kitchen organized. As Greta dried a plate, she noticed a photograph on the windowsill. A young man in uniform, smiling, handsome, full of life. "That's John," Margaret said quietly. "He was 26 when he enlisted. Told me he had to go, that it was the right thing to do. I was so angry at him for leaving." Her voice cracked slightly. "And then he didn't come back." Greta set the plate down carefully. "I am sorry," she said, the words feeling impossibly inadequate. Margaret turned to look at her, really look at her. "How old are you?" 24. "You're just a baby. You're all babies." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." That night, lying on her cot in the barn, warm for the first time in months, with a full stomach and clean blankets, Greta cried silently. Ilse reached across from the next cot and took her hand. "Why are they being kind to us?" Margaret whispered in the darkness. "I don't know," Ilse replied. "But maybe that's just who they are." The days fell into a rhythm. They woke before dawn, dressed in the work clothes Margaret provided, sturdy overalls and flannel shirts that had belonged to John, and began the morning chores. Feeding the chickens was Margaret's job. She developed a soft spot for the hens and named each one. Greta milked the cow, a patient beast named Bessie who seemed to understand that Greta had never milked anything in her life and tolerated her clumsy attempts with surprising grace. Ilse, with her nurse's precision, took charge of the vegetable garden, preparing it for winter, storing the last of the root vegetables in the cellar. The work was hard. Hauling water, splitting firewood, repairing fences, clearing fields of corn stubble. But it was honest work, and there was something healing in the simplicity of it. No bombs falling, no orders to follow, no terror in the night. Just earth and sky and the rhythm of the seasons. Margaret worked alongside them, never asking them to do anything she wouldn't do herself. She taught them how to can vegetables, how to make soap, how to mend harnesses and sharpen tools. In the evenings, after supper, they would sit in the parlor, Margaret knitting, the German women reading or writing letters home, and sometimes Margaret would turn on the radio. They listened to music mostly, avoiding the news. The war was over, but its echoes were still too loud. One evening in early November, there was a knock at the door. Margaret opened it to find Tom Brennan standing on the porch, hat in hand. "Evening, Margaret. Just checking on how things are going with your workers." "Come in, Tom. Coffee?" "Don't mind if I do." They sat at the kitchen table while Greta poured coffee, moving quietly, trying to be invisible. "They're good workers," Margaret said. "Quiet, hard-working, respectful. No trouble at all." Tom nodded. "Same with the girls at my place. Young Margaret, the one with the dark hair. She's teaching my daughter German. Can you imagine? Emily's fascinated by it." He sipped his coffee. "Some folks in town are complaining, saying we shouldn't be treating them so well. But I figure, what's the point of winning a war if we lose our humanity doing it?" Margaret smiled. John would have said the same thing. After Tom left, Margaret turned to Greta. "You speak English well. Where did you learn?" "School. And I listened to American jazz before the war. My father had records, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong. He was a musician before." She trailed off. "Before what?" "Before the party took his job. He was teaching at university. But he would not join the Nazi party, so they dismissed him. He plays piano in beer halls after that, until he is conscripted. I do not know where he is now." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed Greta's hand. "I hope he comes home to you." Winter came to Cedar Ridge with the first snow in late November. The women helped Margaret prepare the farm for the cold months, insulating the barn, stacking firewood, and bringing the last of the harvest into the root cellar. They wore John's old coats and scarves, and Margaret knitted them each a pair of mittens. On Thanksgiving, Margaret invited them into the house for dinner. Greta had learned about Thanksgiving from her school books, a harvest festival, a day of gratitude, but she hadn't expected to be included. The table was laden with food, a roasted chicken. Margaret couldn't afford a turkey, but the chicken was plump and golden, mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans, cranberry sauce from a can, and pumpkin pie. Tom Brennan was there with his wife, Ellen, and their daughter, Emily. Doc Henderson came too, and a widow named Mrs. Kowalski who lived alone in town. "Before we eat," Tom said, standing at the head of the table, "I'd like us to go around and say one thing we're grateful for." Margaret spoke first. "I'm grateful for these women who have helped keep my farm running. I couldn't have done it without them." Doc Henderson said he was grateful the war was over and his sons had come home safe. Mrs. Kowalski was grateful for good neighbors. Young Emily said she was grateful for her new friend Margaret, who was teaching her German words. When it came to Greta's turn, she felt her throat tighten. "I am grateful to be alive, and I am grateful for kindness when I did not deserve it." Margaret's eyes glistened. "Oh, honey, you deserve it just as much as anyone." They ate and laughed and told stories. Tom recounted the time he accidentally let all his pigs loose during a town parade. Doc Henderson told jokes that made everyone groan. For a few hours, they were just people sharing a meal, not conquerors and conquered, not victors and prisoners. As winter deepened, the women became part of the community in small but significant ways. Ilsa began helping Doc Henderson at his clinic, assisting with minor procedures and translating for him when he read German medical journals. Margaret helped Ellen Brennan with her sewing business, her nimble fingers perfect for detailed work. Greta started teaching English lessons to some of the town's children whose parents wanted them to have better opportunities. Christmas came, and Margaret insisted they celebrate. She couldn't afford much, but she made cookies, hung pine branches around the house, and placed small handmade gifts under a modest tree. For Greta, she had knitted a scarf. For Ilsa, a set of nursing supplies she'd somehow acquired. For Margaret, a book of American poetry. The women had pooled their small wages to buy Margaret a gift, a silver frame for the photograph of John. When Margaret unwrapped it, she wept openly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." On Christmas Eve, they walked through the snow to the church in town. Greta had expected resistance, but the pastor welcomed them warmly. "All are welcome in God's house," he said simply. They sat in the back pew, listening to carols sung in English, the organ filling the small church with music. Greta thought of her own church in Hamburg, now probably rubble. She thought of her father and wondered if he was singing somewhere tonight, if he was even alive. The tears came quietly, and Margaret, sitting beside her, took her hand and held it throughout the service. In January, a letter arrived at the Sullivan farm. It was addressed to Greta Hoffmann, forwarded through the Red Cross. Greta held it with trembling hands, afraid to open it, afraid of what it might say. Margaret stood beside her. "Do you want privacy?" "No. Please stay." She opened the envelope carefully. The letter was from her younger sister, Hannah, in Hamburg. Their father had survived. He was in a British POW camp but was being released soon. He had been asking about Greta for months. Hannah had finally tracked her down through the Red Cross. Her father wanted her to know he loved her, that he was proud of her, that he hoped she would come home when she could. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Greta sobbed with relief, and Margaret held her like a daughter, rocking her gently. "He's alive. He's alive." "Of course he is," Margaret said. "And he's waiting for you." But the letter also brought a question that had been growing in Greta's mind for weeks. Did she want to go home? Germany was destroyed, occupied, starving. Here in Cedar Ridge, she had food, work, kindness, hope. She felt guilty for even thinking about it, but the thought wouldn't leave her alone. She shared her confusion with Ilse one evening as they sat in the barn, the stove crackling. "I feel it too," Ilse admitted. "In Germany, everything is broken. Here there's a future. But is it our future? Are we running away or moving forward?" Margaret, who had been quiet, spoke up. "I want to stay. I know that makes me a traitor, but I don't care. There's nothing for me in Germany except ghosts." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the barn door. It was Tom Brennan, looking serious. "Ladies, could you come up to Margaret's house? There's something we need to discuss." In Margaret's parlor, they found Doc Henderson, Tom, Ellen, and several other townspeople gathered. Tom cleared his throat. "We've been talking, and we want to make you all an official proposal. The POW program is ending in a few months. You'll be sent back to Germany. But we'd like to sponsor you to stay here permanently, as residents, eventually as citizens. We'll help you with the paperwork, the fees, whatever it takes. You've proven yourselves to be good people and hard workers. We'd be lucky to have you as neighbors." Greta couldn't speak. Margaret smiled at her. "You don't have to answer now. Think about it. But know that you're wanted here." Over the following weeks, the women wrestled with their decision. Ilse wrote to her sister in Berlin and received a reply urging her to stay in America if she could. Margaret made her choice quickly. She wanted to stay, to build a new life far from the ruins of the old one. Greta was torn. She missed her father desperately, but she also knew that in Germany, she would be just another defeated soldier, another mouth to feed in a starving country. Here she had a future. She had friends. She had Margaret, who treated her like family. One evening, she sat with Margaret on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the February cold, watching the sun set over the frozen fields. "What should I do?" Greta asked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I can't answer that for you, honey, but I can tell you this. You're not abandoning your father by choosing to live. You're honoring what he fought to protect, your future. If he loves you half as much as I think he does, he wants you to be happy and safe. And if you stay here, you can send money home, help him rebuild. You can visit when things settle down. This doesn't have to be forever, just for now." Greta nodded slowly. "I think I want to stay." Margaret put her arm around her. "Then we'll make it work. I'll help you every step of the way." By spring, the paperwork was underway. Tom Brennan used his connections as mayor to expedite the process. Doc Henderson wrote letters of recommendation. Margaret submitted affidavits vouching for Greta's character. The process was slow and bureaucratic, but there was hope. Greta threw herself into her new life. She improved her English, learned to drive Margaret's old truck, took on more responsibilities at the farm. She started writing regular letters to her father, telling him about Cedar Ridge, about the people who had welcomed her, about the strange second chance she had been given. His letters back were full of love and understanding. "My dear Greta," he wrote in April, "I am so proud of you. You have found a place where you can grow and thrive. That is all a father could wish for his daughter. Build your life there. Be happy. I will be here when you can visit, but do not hurry back to these ruins. There is time." In May, the farm burst into life. They planted corn, beans, tomatoes, and squash. Greta discovered she had a talent for gardening, a patience for coaxing life from the soil. She and Margaret worked side by side, their hands dirty, their faces sun-browned, talking about everything and nothing. Recipes, weather, memories, dreams. One Saturday, Margaret took Greta into town for the farmer's market. They set up a table with eggs, vegetables, and Margaret's preserves. People stopped to chat, to buy, to say hello. Old Mrs. Kowalski bought 2 jars of strawberry jam and told Greta her English was improving beautifully. Emily Brennan ran up with a drawing she'd made, a picture of Margaret teaching her German words. "Tell Margaret I miss her," she said. As they packed up at the end of the day, a man approached, middle-aged, wearing a veteran's cap. Greta tensed, recognizing the insignia. He had fought in Europe. "You're one of the German girls, aren't you?" he said. "Yes, sir," Greta replied quietly, preparing for anger, but he smiled. "My daughter takes English lessons from you. She's learned more in 2 months than she did in 2 years at school. Thank you for that." "It is my pleasure," Greta managed. He hesitated, then extended his hand. "I'm Robert Jensen. I was at the Bulge, saw some tough fighting. Lost friends. For a long time, I thought I'd hate every German I ever met. But then I met you girls, working hard, being respectful, and I realized you're not the enemy. You never were. The people who started this war, who made us fight each other, they're the enemy. You and me? We're just people trying to survive." Greta shook his hand, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for understanding." That summer was the happiest Greta could remember since before the war. The crops grew tall. The sun was warm. In the evenings, they would sit on Margaret's porch, drinking lemonade, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of children playing. Sometimes neighbors would stop by. Tom and Ellen, Doc Henderson, Mrs. Kowalski, and they would talk late into the night, sharing stories and laughter. Margaret started courting a young farmer named Paul, a quiet man who had lost his brother in the Pacific. They would take long walks together, and Margaret would return glowing. Ilsa began working full-time at Doc Henderson's clinic and was saving money to take nursing courses at the State College. Greta helped Margaret run the farm and taught English 3 evenings a week at the town hall. In August, the official papers arrived. They had been approved for permanent residency. They could stay in America legally, work legally, build lives legally. The women celebrated with a special dinner. Margaret cooked a feast, and half the town seemed to show up to congratulate them. Tom Brennan raised a glass. "To new neighbors, new friends, and new beginnings. Welcome home, ladies. Welcome home," the room echoed. Greta looked around at the faces. Margaret, who had lost her husband but opened her heart anyway. Tom and Ellen, who chose compassion over bitterness. Doc Henderson, who saw patients, not enemies. Emily, who saw a friend in Margaret, not a former foe. These people had taught her something she thought the world had forgotten. That kindness is not weakness, that mercy is not foolishness, that humanity can survive even the worst we do to each other. 5 years passed. Greta stood in the kitchen of what was now legally her house. Margaret had insisted on adding her to the deed, kneading dough for bread. Through the window, she could see the fields green with corn, the barn freshly painted, chickens scratching in the yard. Margaret was in town delivering preserves to the market. At 62, she was still as strong as ever, but she moved a little slower now, and Greta had taken on more of the heavy work. The sound of a car engine made Greta look up. A taxi was coming up the drive, dust rising behind it. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, curious. The taxi stopped. The back door opened, and there, climbing out stiffly, leaning on a cane but smiling, was her father. Greta's breath caught. "Papa." "Greta, mein Liebling," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She flew down the steps and into his arms, and they stood there in the Missouri sunlight, holding each other and crying. 5 years of letters, of longing, of separation. All of it dissolved in that embrace. "You came," she sobbed. "You really came. Did you think I would not? I had to see this place you wrote about, this Cedar Ridge. I had to see you happy with my own eyes." Margaret arrived home an hour later and found them sitting on the porch, talking rapidly in German and English, laughing and crying in turns. She climbed out of her truck, took one look at them, and understood immediately. "You must be Herr Hoffmann," she said, walking up with her hand extended. He stood, leaning on his cane, and took her hand. "And you must be Margaret. My daughter writes of you in every letter. Thank you for taking care of her when I could not." Margaret's eyes filled. "She's not been a burden, Herr Hoffmann. She's been a blessing." They made up the guest room for him, and he stayed for 3 weeks. Greta took him everywhere, showed him the farm, introduced him to everyone in town, took him to church on Sunday, and brought him to her English classes. He charmed everyone he met with his old-world manners and his gratitude. One evening, he played piano at the town hall. Margaret had arranged it specially. The townspeople gathered, filling every seat, and he played Beethoven and Brahms, but also American jazz, the music he had loved before the war, the music that had cost him his job. His fingers were stiff, and he made mistakes, but the music was beautiful nonetheless, full of longing and joy and sorrow all at once. When he finished, the audience stood and applauded. Tom Brennan wiped his eyes. Doc Henderson blew his nose loudly. Margaret clapped until her hands hurt. Greta sat in the front row, watching her father bow, and thought, "This is healing. This is what it looks like when the world begins to mend." Before he left to return to Germany, he had visa restrictions and responsibilities there. Her father took Greta's hands in his. "You were right to stay," he said. "This is where you belong now. These people love you and you love them. You have built something good here. I am so proud of you. Come back," she begged. "Come back and stay. Perhaps someday. But for now, I have my students again. The university reinstated me. I have a small apartment and I can play music again. I am content. And I know you are safe and happy. That is enough." 10 years later, Greta married Robert Jensen, the veteran who had first shaken her hand at the farmer's market. Their wedding was held in the White Church in Cedar Ridge, with Margaret standing as mother of the bride. Ilsa was maid of honor, having completed her nursing degree and now running the clinic with Doc Henderson, who was training her to take over when he retired. Margaret and Paul came with their 3 children. Tom Brennan gave a toast that made everyone laugh and cry. Greta wore a simple white dress and carried wildflowers from the field where she had first learned to plant corn. As she walked down the aisle, she thought of all the improbable turns her life had taken. From radio operator in a losing army to prisoner on a train to resident of a small Missouri town to wife, friend, teacher, farmer. She thought of Margaret, sitting in the front pew, beaming. Margaret, who could have chosen hatred but chose love. Margaret, who saw a frightened girl and offered her a home. The pastor pronounced them married, and Robert kissed her gently. The congregation applauded. The organ played, and Greta knew with complete certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. 25 years after the war ended, Margaret Sullivan passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 79. The funeral was held on a bright October day, much like the day Greta had first arrived in Cedar Ridge. The church was packed. It seemed the entire town had come to pay respects. Greta stood at the pulpit, her hair now streaked with gray, her hands steady. "Margaret taught me that kindness is a choice," she said to the gathered mourners. She could have chosen bitterness after losing her husband. She could have chosen hatred when a group of German POWs was sent to work her farm. But she chose kindness. She chose to see us as people, not enemies. And in doing so, she changed our lives. She changed my life. Completely. She gave me a home when I had none. She gave me a family when mine was an ocean away. She taught me what it means to be truly generous, truly compassionate, truly brave. I hope I can honor her memory by trying to be even half the person she was. After the service, people came up to share their own stories of Margaret's kindness. How she had brought food to families during hard times. How she had sat with the sick. How she had welcomed strangers and turned them into friends. The stories went on for hours. Margaret left the farm to Greta in her will. "You've been more of a daughter to me than I had any right to hope for." The letter accompanying the will read, "Take care of the land. Take care of the people. Keep choosing kindness." Greta honored that request. She and Robert expanded the farm, hired workers during harvest season, always paid fair wages, and always treated people with dignity. They had 2 children, a son they named John, after Margaret's husband, and a daughter they named Margaret. Young Margaret grew up hearing stories about her namesake, about the war, about the unlikely friendship between a widow and a former enemy soldier. She grew up knowing that people are complicated, that history is messy, that the most important thing is how we treat each other when we have every excuse not to. When Margaret was 16, she asked her mother, "Do you ever regret staying? Do you ever wish you'd gone back to Germany?" Greta thought carefully before answering. "I regret that I couldn't be with my father more in his final years. He passed when you were 5. I regret the distance, the lost time. But I don't regret building a life here. Cedar Ridge gave me a second chance. Your namesake gave me a second chance. I try to pass that gift forward every day." And she did. Greta became a pillar of the Cedar Ridge community. She taught English to immigrants for 40 years. She helped sponsor refugees from Vietnam, from Bosnia, from Somalia, offering them the same chance she had been given. She served on the town council, the school board, the church committee. She organized the town's annual peace festival, which brought people together to celebrate diversity and reconciliation. When she was 70 years old, Greta was invited to speak at the local high school about her experiences. She stood before a classroom of teenagers and told them about the train ride to Cedar Ridge, about the fear and shame she'd felt, about Margaret's unexpected kindness. "I was your age when the war started," she told them. "I believed things I shouldn't have believed. I followed orders I shouldn't have followed. I was part of a system that did terrible things. I can't change that, but I can choose what I do with the rest of my life. I can choose to be better." That's what Margaret taught me. It's never too late to choose kindness over hatred, hope over despair, connection over division. A student raised her hand. "Do you think something like the war could happen again?" Greta didn't hesitate. "Yes, absolutely. It happens when we forget to see each other as human beings. It happens when we let fear and hatred guide our choices. It happens when we forget that the person we think of as other or enemy is someone's daughter, someone's father, someone's friend. We have to remember that. Always." On Greta's 80th birthday, the town of Cedar Ridge threw her a surprise party. The town hall was decorated with photographs spanning decades. Greta as a young POW working in Margaret's fields. Greta on her wedding day. Greta teaching English classes. Greta with her children and grandchildren. Greta receiving her citizenship certificate in 1952. Greta cutting the ribbon at the new community center. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The mayor, Emily Brennan, Tom's daughter, now 65 herself, gave a speech. "Greta Hoffmann Jensen came to Cedar Ridge as a prisoner," she said. "But she became one of us. She embodies the best of what this town stands for: hard work, generosity, forgiveness, and an unwavering commitment to treating every person with dignity. She's taught us that our identity isn't about where we come from, but about how we choose to live. Happy birthday, Greta. Thank you for choosing us." The room erupted in applause. Greta, surrounded by children, grandchildren, friends, and neighbors, felt overwhelmed with gratitude. She thought of that frightened young woman on the train, convinced her life was over. She thought of Margaret, opening her home and her heart. She thought of all the small acts of kindness that had woven together to create this life, this beautiful, improbable life. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice breaking. "Thank you for making this my home. Greta Hoffmann Jensen passed away at the age of 91, surrounded by her family. Her funeral was attended by hundreds, people whose lives she had touched over 7 decades in Cedar Ridge. The mayor declared it Greta Hoffmann Day, and a scholarship fund was established in her name for children of immigrants. Her granddaughter, also named Greta, became a history teacher. She specialized in teaching about World War II, about the complexities of war and peace, about the power of reconciliation. She always began her unit by telling her students about a train full of German POWs arriving in a small Missouri town, and about a widow who chose kindness when she could have chosen hatred. That choice, she would tell her students, changed everything. The Sullivan Jensen farm still stands, now run by Greta's son, John. He maintains it much as his mother and Margaret did, as a place of hard work, honest dealing, and open doors. Every October, on the anniversary of Greta's arrival, the family gathers at the farm for a reunion. They share a meal, tell stories, and remember. The town of Cedar Ridge grew over the decades, but it never forgot its history. A small museum opened on Main Street, dedicated to preserving the stories of the town's past. One room was devoted entirely to the POW program and the women who had stayed. Photographs lined the walls. Greta, Ilsa, and Margaret in their work clothes, standing in front of the Sullivan barn. Margaret and Greta side by side at the farmer's market. The whole group at Christmas dinner in 1945. There were artifacts too. The silver frame Greta had given Margaret for John's photograph, now donated by the family. One of Margaret's hand-knitted scarves. Letters between Greta and her father, preserved behind glass. The deed to the farm showing both Margaret's and Greta's names. Greta's naturalization certificate from 1952, yellowed with age but still legible. School groups visited regularly. Children would stand before the exhibits, reading the placards, asking questions. Why were they nice to the Germans? One boy asked his teacher during a visit. The teacher, who had been taught by Greta decades earlier, smiled. Because they understood something important, that the people we fight in wars are human beings too. They have families, dreams, fears just like us. And when the fighting stops, we have a choice. We can keep hating, or we can start healing. Cedar Ridge chose healing. Ilsa lived to be 96, the last surviving member of the original group. She had never married, dedicating her life to nursing and medicine. She had trained 3 generations of nurses at the Cedar Ridge Clinic, which had grown into a small hospital. On her 90th birthday, the hospital board voted unanimously to name the maternity wing after her. The Ilsa Fisher Wing, where new life came into the world under her watchful legacy. In her final interview with the local newspaper, just months before she died, Ilsa was asked what she wanted people to remember about those years. "Remember that we were terrified," she said, her voice still strong despite her age. "We expected punishment, expected to be treated as we had seen others treated. But these people, these good people, showed us mercy. They gave us work, dignity, and hope. They could have broken us. Instead, they helped us heal. That's what I want people to remember. That kindness is more powerful than cruelty. That building is harder than destroying, but infinitely more worthwhile." Margaret had passed away younger at 73 from cancer, but she left behind 5 children, 14 grandchildren, and a legacy of service. She had started Cedar Ridge's first library, volunteered at the elementary school for 40 years, and taught German to anyone who wanted to learn. Her husband Paul, who outlived her by a decade, kept her memory alive by continuing her tradition of hosting international students at their home, offering them the same welcome Margaret had received all those years ago. One of those students, a young man from Syria fleeing the civil war, would later say, "Mrs. Weber made me feel human again. She understood what it was like to be a stranger in a strange land, to be afraid, to wonder if you'll ever belong anywhere again. She taught me that home isn't always where you're born. Sometimes it's where you're welcomed." The story of Cedar Ridge and its German POWs spread beyond the town. Historians wrote papers about it. Documentary filmmakers came to interview the surviving residents. A novelist wrote a book loosely based on the events, which became a bestseller and introduced the story to millions. But for the people of Cedar Ridge, it wasn't history. It was family lore, passed down from grandparents to grandchildren, a reminder of who they were and who they aspired to be. On the 100th anniversary of the end of World War II, 2045, the town held a special commemoration. The descendants of Margaret Sullivan, Greta Hoffmann, Ilse Fisher, and Margaret Schneider all gathered, along with descendants of Tom Brennan, Doc Henderson, and the other townspeople who had chosen compassion over vengeance. They stood together in front of a newly unveiled monument in the town square. A simple stone carved with the names of the 4 German women and Margaret Sullivan, and beneath their names, a single line, "They chose kindness." Young Greta, now 70 herself, a history teacher retired but still passionate about education, gave the keynote speech. "My grandmother used to tell me that every person we meet is fighting a battle we know nothing about," she said. She learned that here in Cedar Ridge, when she was at her lowest point and this town lifted her up. The people of Cedar Ridge in 1945 could have been cruel. They had every reason to be. They had lost sons and brothers and husbands to the war. But they looked at 4 frightened women and saw not enemies, but human beings in need of mercy. That choice, that simple, powerful choice to see humanity in the other, changed my grandmother's life. It changed my life because I wouldn't exist without it. And it changed this town, because Cedar Ridge became known not for its size or its wealth, but for its character. We live in difficult times. The division seems to be winning. It's easy to hate, easy to see only what separates us, easy to dehumanize those we disagree with or fear. But my grandmother's story reminds us that we always have a choice. We can choose fear or courage. We can choose hatred or love. We can choose to see enemies or to see neighbors. Cedar Ridge chose well in 1945. Let us choose well today and every day forward. Let us honor these women, all of them, by continuing to choose kindness, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The crowd stood in silence for a moment, and then applause began. Tentative at first, then building until it echoed across the square. After the ceremony, people gathered at the town hall for a reception. The walls were covered with photographs and letters and artifacts. A piano sat in the corner, a baby grand donated years ago by Greta's father during his final visit to Cedar Ridge before his death. Someone began to play it, first a German folk song, then an American hymn, the 2 melodies weaving together. Children played in the yard outside, descendants of both nations that had once been at war, now simply children being children, laughing, shouting, chasing each other in the golden afternoon light. An elderly man, the great-grandson of Robert Jensen, stood next to a young woman, the great-great-granddaughter of Margaret Sullivan. They didn't know each other well. Their families had drifted apart over the decades, but here, on this day, they stood together watching the children play. "It's remarkable, isn't it?" the woman said. "How much can change in 100 years? And how much stays the same?" the man replied. "We still need kindness. We still need people willing to extend a hand instead of a fist. My great-great-grandmother knew that. So did mine." They stood together in comfortable silence, bearing witness to a legacy they were both part of, a story that belonged to all of them now. A story of war and peace, of hatred and love, of separation and reunion, of the long, slow work of healing. As the sun began to set over Cedar Ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the descendants of all those who had lived this history gathered for a final photograph. Dozens of people, multiple generations, standing together beneath the monument that bore the names of those who had started it all. And in that photograph, if you looked closely, you could see it, the legacy of a choice made 80 years earlier, the ripple effects of mercy extended when it wasn't deserved, the proof that kindness, once planted, grows beyond anything we can imagine. The story of Cedar Ridge and its German POWs became more than history. It became a reminder, a challenge, a question posed to every generation. When faced with someone you have every reason to hate, what will you choose? Margaret Sullivan chose kindness. Cedar Ridge chose compassion. And the world became a little bit better because of it.